Fantastic. This is so great to be here. I haven't been to ABBA for a long time, or Cal ABBA rather, and I really appreciate being asked to speak. You know, when you get to be an invited speaker, you kind of are given a blank check, and even after I described what I was going to talk about, I still know exactly what I was going to talk about. And you know, you can, on one end, you can show lots of cases and data and stuff like that. But on the other end, you can do something a little different, which is what I wanted to do today. You'll see some words up here, the 6 boxes and performance thinking, which are part of our logo and our business name. And that's come to mean something over actually quite a long period of time in my work. And so what I decided to do is to try to give you a little bit of a tour about how we got here and then kind of what we're doing with one example in a big company. And sort of to make sense out of what I'm going to show you, because it's a little bit different from some of the things in OBM, although many or most of the components will be familiar with you, or to you. So let me just sort of start at the beginning. Like most of the people in the room, one way or the other, we were influenced by Dr. Skinner. And as Cloyd said, I had the remarkable opportunity to actually study with Dr. Skinner a little bit at Harvard. I was actually a philosophy student, and I read Walden 2 in the late 60s. And initially I was appalled. I thought it was about, I don't know what, Brave New World or something. And then I reread it, and the lights went off, and I said, oh my God, this man is just saying if we take the same approach to our own behavior as we do to biology and chemistry and physics and so forth, we'll be able to discover things to make education and therapy and management and et cetera, better. That's incredible. I was very excited, and I wrote him this maniacal letter. And I don't have a copy of it, unfortunately, but I have a copy of the letter he wrote me back in 2 weeks. And he expressed, I mean, he was good. He waited for the organism to respond, but once it did, he reinforced the behavior. And he did. It was a very friendly letter, which I have framed on my wall still. And he basically said, if there's any way I can help you, please keep in touch. So about a year later, I took advantage of that, and I kind of hitchhiked into Cambridge, Massachusetts, long hair and looking like a kind of hippie of those days, a graduate student, I guess, of those days, and walked in on Dr. Skinner unannounced, and he spent an hour with me, and he said, why don't you come here? And so that was kind of mind-blowing, because I certainly never thought I would be doing that. But he was the first big influence on me, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, as he was for everyone here. The second influence, at least in this conversation, is Ogden Lindsley, and many of you may know Ogden. I had the good fortune, after working with B. Barrett, to be introduced to Ogden, and as I'll probably restate shortly, it's my belief that if there were such a thing as a Nobel Prize for performance or behavior measurement, Ogden should have gotten it for the standard acceleration chart. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. Ogden had an influence in a variety of ways. And then the third person that probably many or most of you know about was Tom Gilbert. And Tom, of course, had at one point been a postdoc with Skinner, and he and Ogden knew each other. They used to, according to Ogden, have literally pissing contests, but he was a crazy, brilliant man, and many of you have probably read the book Human Competence, and he taught me about accomplishments and about looking at the environment that supports behavior systemically in a way that sort of expanded Skinner's 3-term contingency. And again, I'll refer to Tom's work a little bit, his influence. And then Joe Harless, who probably most of you don't know, but maybe some of you do. Joe was a protege of Tom Gilbert's. And he was a kind of an icon and a thought leader in the ISPI organization that Cloyd just mentioned. And Joe was a brilliant man. He took Tom's work, especially with the focus on accomplishments versus behavior, and he turned it into a very successful business. And he also brought a lot of wisdom to how you sort of get things into organizations. And so I learned a lot from Joe, who unfortunately passed away just about a year ago. And then there was one more big influence, and it's funny because having watched Joe's talk this morning when he held up his iPhone, I realized that I was also going to mention this man, and I'm not being trendy here. In the late 70s, Ogden Lindsley was a big fan of Apple Computer. He had one of the first Apple IIs. And he got me paying attention to Steve Jobs early on. And the thing that Steve was about was making the user experience easy. And so I want to talk about that because Jobs literally was an influence on me from those days on. And the thing that Joe held up this morning, the iPhone, is an example of why, because he made things accessible to people. He understood design in a way that made things accessible. So I'll show you a little bit about that influence. So let's go back a little bit, starting with Skinner. He gave us the three-term contingency. We talk about applied behavior analysis or behavior analysis, and that's where it started. And these are different language versions of it. You can go from the geeky one with the superscripts that we good hardcore scientists know, and then you can talk about antecedents and behavior consequences, or ABC. And of course from that came behavior management that we all know and love. And in this room, of course, organizational behavior management. And that's where I started. And when I started working in the early 70s with actually severely, we then call them people with retardation in the institution with B. Barrett, we were managing behavior. And we were also doing instruction, but we were doing an awful lot of management of behavior. Now, from Skinner, I came to learn about Lindsley. And what Lindsley brought to us was this standard measurement system, and I'm only going to show you a few charts today, but one of the things that this charting system allowed us to do was to understand performance and learning in a way that other graphic systems don't. This is a really simple example of monthly revenues in a small consulting firm, and you'll notice that there's acceleration or a trend that goes like this, and then there's an intervention, a different billing system. And what's exciting about this is you notice that the change is a reduction in variability, but the trend continues in the same angle, the same acceleration. Now, conventional charts that we use, add-subtract charts, as Og would call them, wouldn't be able to distinguish between trend and level or variability in this way. And so I learned a lot from Ogden about measurement, especially to be counting things. And of course, there's a book I wanted to highlight that if you don't know about this book, it's fairly obscure. You can get it from the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Studies. But Ogden wrote a chapter which was supposed to be in the American Psychologist in the issue that was devoted to Skinner's work. And it was never finally published there. But after Ogden and Lindsley died, his students sort of cleaned it up and published this little book. And it's a brilliant book on measurement that anybody's actually interested in the science should probably read. Moving right along, here comes Gilbert. So we know about managing behavior, but Gilbert was rather outspoken in many ways, but he talked about the great cult of behavior. And of course, he was working in what he called the world of work, the world that you and I are in, organizations. And he said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So this was a big insight, because what it pointed out was we can behave all day, but if we don't produce something valuable for the organization, it's not much use to the organization. And so this was an enormous pushback in some respects against behavior management, because what Gilbert taught us, and many of us have taken this up, of course, is that we need to look at the accomplishments, or what I've come to call work outputs, the products of behavior that are valuable to the extent they contribute to business results. Now, Chima Min, who's somebody you never heard about, he's a British fellow that we work with occasionally, and he summarized it rather nicely. He said work outputs are what organizations need from their people. In other words, they don't really care about your behavior. They care about the behavior that produces valuable outputs. And so that's a big insight. Now, it's even true if you go back to the Skinner box, or operant conditioning chamber, as Dr. Skinner would have preferred us to call it. It's not the key packing that we care about. It's the switch closure. So something that Hank Pennypacker pointed out to me years ago, that the animal can be pecking all day or can be doing all kinds of behavior, but it's the peck that closes the switch that produces the food that's actually valuable. Now that might seem kind of silly on the surface of it, but in terms of value delivered, that's really where the value is, the product of behavior. So I learned that. That was a big thing for me, and I learned it really not until the early 1980s when I was starting to really work in organizations. Another thing that Gilbert gave us, and this is where the 6 boxes model came from, as you'll see. How many people know about the behavior engineering model? Lots of you, a fair number. Okay, well, in Gilbert's rather famous book, Human Competence, he has a model, and the model is called the behavior engineering model. Now, it starts out really with the 3-term contingency as the kind of foundation, or as the superstructure. And so we can talk about antecedents, behavior, and consequences. We can talk about SDs and responses and reinforcing stimuli. He sort of categorized these 3 things as information, response, and motivation. He was sort of trying to really, I always see this as a little bit of a force fit, but it was a pretty brilliant insight. Because then what he said is, in humans, unlike starved pigeons in operant conditioning boxes, there's a lot to look at in the individual. And let me just stop for a moment. If you think about a white Carnot pigeon or a rat that we've starved to 80% body weight, we don't have to worry about the reinforcer. We can provide so-called incentives and be pretty sure that will reinforce behavior. But in you or me, that's not true. Like my silly joke is always, if you tell me, come on down to my house, we're serving, Grey Goose martinis with olives straight up, I'll be right down. But if you tell me there's rum Coke, I'll probably turn on the TV and not go. I don't really work for rum Coke. Now that's a silly example, but we all know this. And we know that, for example, whether we're managers or whether we're organizing things as a system or a program rollout, we need to be sure that the consequences we're using are actually consequences. And that was one of the really cool things about Joe's talk this morning. One of the big things I learned, one of the things I wrote down, was this idea of getting the performer to tell you. I mean, we always say, ask the performer, observe the performer, but for them to actually have this conversation where they describe what they did that made a difference and why, and actually it did make a difference and they get into it, man, we're plugging right into what that person's motives are. We're actually, this was Gilbert's way, really, of taking functional analysis into account, because we all know a reinforcer isn't one unless it actually accelerates behavior. And so this was the way of saying, okay, so we need to check for the individual to see whether this so-called incentive actually is one. And the way he captured this was in motives. Similarly, for a pigeon or a rat, or even a human in Ogden Lindsley's operant conditioning chamber, the response mechanism is pretty simple. In the laboratory, we define the user interface, we might call it now, as something which is easy to respond to, that doesn't produce fatigue, that can be operated at a fairly high frequency, and so forth. And I think that's where Tom got the word instruments. But notice in our world, it's not quite like that. We're using, axes and screwdrivers and wrenches and computers and all this other stuff. And so what Tom recognized was, first of all, that this is a big variable. Knowing what the so-called instrument is, what the environmental factors are in terms of the way it's designed and even the lighting and stuff, is a big deal for humans. And that you also had to match that to humans' ability to use that, to interact with that. So that's a thing which is a little different than just the simple, straight-ahead three-term contingency. And then the other thing that I think Tom got was that when we're working with those pigeons and rats, we try to get so-called naive subjects. We don't want them to have a prerequisite repertoire. But we humans bring a repertoire to the table. And so one way to capture that is to talk about knowledge. What is the knowledge that I or you bring to the table? Beyond just what the immediate antecedents are. So this was Tom's model. And I got turned on to it in about 81 or 82. And during that time, I was starting to work with salespeople in banks. Actually, they were loan officers who, because of deregulation, were being made to become salespeople, which was quite a transition. So we were teaching these loan officers how to sell stuff, how to probe for needs, how to then be able to talk about their products and services. And we were applying what I learned from precision teaching. We were building a fluency-based program that enabled these salespeople to really know what they were talking about, to be able to answer questions and ask questions, to be able to have a conversation and identify needs, to be able to link those needs to product solutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, that was all great in the training classroom. What happened when they got out on the job? So this turned out to be a brilliant solution because what we recognize is, okay, we can do a fantastic job of building fluent knowledge. But if these guys go out on the job and essentially the expectations are not set for them to apply this new knowledge, or they don't have things like the right sales materials or the right environmental factors to do it, or if there's no payoff for them doing the new stuff, it ain't gonna work. So as instructional designers and performance improvement folks, I and the team of people I was leading found this to be brilliant because we could say, okay, let's think about how we're going to arrange the other variables in this model. How are we going to take that into account? And it worked really well, and we wound up being able to take training programs which historically got people really knowledgeable but then fell flat in their face because there wasn't any real performance support in the working environment, and we got them very successful. And we knocked the tops off of people's expectations about what's possible with that kind of thing. Now the trouble is that when you're doing this kind of work, you'd like to be talking to your clients, right? You'd like to be speaking with the stakeholders, the managers and the executives and stuff. But when we took Tom's model, which we thought was brilliant, and started talking to people about it, it was like, oops. And this was about 86, 87. And what we found was people say, wait a minute, what's that instruments thing again? Tell me what that is again. And you know, if they were engineers, they think it was an ohm meter, or you know, if they were HR people, they might think it's a personality assessment. Or data, you know, they say, well, you mean like on spreadsheets and stuff, or what? This was just the beginnings of spreadsheets in those days, actually. And so these words just didn't work very well. They said, where's the word skills? Oh, well, that's kind of in this box. What do you mean by capacity? They said, you know what? Oh, you mean what the individual's able to do? Is that what you mean? That's a funny word for that. So this language wasn't working too well for people. And that's, you know, one of the things is that Ogden, in all of his work with precision teaching and the standard acceleration chart, had tried to emphasize we should communicate with our colleagues and learners in plain English, as simply as possible. We should try to talk in their language. So for example, instead of talking about negative reinforcement, Ogden used the word relief as a simple example, etc. And of course, that's what I learned from Steve too. And believe me, I was thinking about it, because I was thinking about, wait a minute, this model, this 6 boxes, behavior engineering model thing, is kind of the interface in our conversation, really. If we're going to have a conversation with our clients, we can't be talking to them in geek speak. You know, they're going to, believe me, you guys have worked with managers and executives, they're going to be out, you know, they're going to be looking at their watch and stuff. So that's why we came up with this. And so in about 1987, I started, again, following in Jobs' had said a little bit, I started user testing the language. And so we came up with versions of words for those cells in that model. And what we were trying to do is to come up with words where if people read them or heard them, they'd probably not make category errors. They probably wouldn't get confused about what they meant. And so when I knew I had it, which was toward the end of the 80s, was when I could literally sit down with somebody, 10 or 15 minutes over lunch, maybe on my way out of some meeting, and then I'd see some guy that would ask me a question, and I'd say, wait a minute, let me show you this. And I literally would like sit down on the back of an envelope, or sometimes a napkin, you know, draw those boxes out, write the words in, and explain it to them. They say, oh, that's pretty cool, you know. And then I'd leave, and I can't tell you how many times I came back, maybe weeks later, and some of them literally would have the napkin or the envelope on their wall, on their like cubicle, or they'd made their own nicer looking copy because I kind of don't write very neatly. But the point is, these words work. We said, we got it. This is it. This works. Now the problem was, this was whenever it was, late 80s, and I think Tom was still with us actually, Tom Gilbert. I don't think he died yet if I recall. But so I started getting, so I didn't know what to call this. Because conceptually it was, yeah, of course it was kind of the behavior engineering model, but it really wasn't, because it wasn't his words. And so I was always stumbling over this. And I had one client at Dun & Bradstreet at the time. We were working with their sales and marketing organization. Like about 1990, I think it was, 1991, plus or minus. Tom Hogan. And Tom was just an old sales guy. He was really a smart guy. And one day I was up there, I was saying, well, the performance editor, I don't know, whatever we call this model we use. And he said, look, you always talk about those boxes. Why don't you just call it the 6 boxes? Pretty good. So we tried that, and it stuck, and eventually we trademarked it. So the reason, and some people get a little cranky about the fact that we trademark it, but we really mean this language. This is a user-tested thing. This language works. Somebody else can develop their own version, that's fine. A lot of people, if you look in the literature, if you even Google the behavior engineering model, you will see many variants of it. And if you go back to Tom Gilbert, you'll say, wait a minute, that's not the behavior engineering model. That's some mix of, you know, Tom's thing and maybe Binder's thing and some other words that somebody came up with. So we wanted to be really clear about this because we think it's a very effective, user-tested tool for rapid comprehension of the variables that affect performance or behavior. So that's where it came from. Now, this still wasn't the whole story, though, because we started using this. And this was then during the 90s. I had a company that was exclusively devoted to sales and marketing organizations. And we were building fluent performance in sales and marketing organizations in about a dozen industries. And we really got it down to a pretty powerful methodology, and we did this for quite a while. One of the things that this model did is it got us out of the training box in the sense that so many companies thought, oh, we want product knowledge training. Well, that's fine, but that's not going to do it. You need something bigger. So this enabled us to begin having the conversation about these other variables. We'd say, well, that's great. We can do a terrific training program for you, believe me. But let's have a little bit, let's have a little bit of a conversation about, you know, what's in these other categories, because we want to be sure that we insert this thing into an environment where it's going to support performance. So it got us out of the training box. You know, as an example, in a call center, because we also did this work in customer service environments, at one AT&T customer call center, they started out essentially focusing on new hire training. And so there was a lot of knowledge. You know, they had knowledge about the cell phones and the services. They had access to information in the CRM system, the online system. There's a bunch of knowledge that they were either trained in or they were provided documentation in. And that was fine. We said, well, let's crank this one up with some fluency-based stuff. So here's just an example on the standard chart of individuals. This happens to be 3 different sets of facts where people were practicing on a daily basis. And this is count per minute of correct responding. And so we had very nice practice activities where we could get these people up to 80 to 100 a minute on these facts. And believe me, when you're 80, 100 a minute, you're not going to forget them. You're going to use them. They're going to be at the tip of your tongue. So that was great. But the fact is we did a whole ton of other stuff too in these other boxes. You know, we for example, the business unit manager started out and said, you know, this is a challenging industry. You're going to have people yelling in your ears. This program is going to be a little bit different than you've ever been in because we're going to give you a lot of time to practice. And we're going to ask you to keep doing better until you're fluent. And that's going to really help you on the job. And, you know, we built a culture of fluency. There were call monitoring checklists that were incorporated into training. One of the things that always blows my mind, you may have seen this too, Joe. I have worked in a lot of customer call centers. And most customer call centers these days have checklists that specify behavior that when the people listen in on the phone calls, they check, yeah, use the customer's name, didn't swear at them, whatever. You know, they've got behavioral checklist stuff. And I can't tell you how many call centers I've been into where I started to work with the training and management people, and I'd say, do you show these people those checklists during new hire training and onboarding so they'll know what's expected? And I swear they look at me like deers in the headlights. It's like, oh, we never thought of that. You know? But so anyway, we showed them the checklist, you know, and then showed them how to actually meet those expectations. And we built in feedback, you know, supervisors and leads, ongoing kind of thing. Not nearly as cool as what Joe was describing this morning, but the same kind of face-to-face feedback. You know, we built some better tools and job aids. We arranged consequences. We did a bunch of stuff. And so that's the direction that we took with this model, you know, and this is the kind of result we got in this particular place. This happens to be calls per minute. You could think of it as calls per hour. This doesn't look like a traditional behavioral graph because it's actually 2 different groups. And if you explode it out, what you've got is the open circles are the calls per unit of time that a new hire training group had done in their first few weeks on the job. And this was the benchmark they were trying to achieve. This is pretty much the effect of the traditional training. The black ones are what the folks who went through our sort of onboarding program got to. They hit the benchmark in a few days and they beat it by 60% within a couple of weeks. So we got a big uptick in this stuff. And we basically, I spent quite a few years with a business devoted to mostly sales and customer service doing that kind of thing. That's until about, what is it, 7 years ago now, that's what I was doing. Which is cool, no problem. But one of my frustrations was I wanted to do more. You know, it's great, I love doing consulting work, I like projects, I like to go in and help companies do stuff. But I want to, you know, I was a student, like some of you, with one way or the other, with B.F. Skinner. I want to change the world. So this wasn't quite enough for me. I wanted to figure out how to get, not just change everybody in the world, but at least change more people in the company than just some narrow group of specialists that we were working with. I wanted to figure out a way to leverage what we knew about performance improvement, behavior science more broadly. And this man, as I mentioned him earlier, Joe Harless, he was a graduate student and then a colleague with Tom Gilbert. And they used to talk about the revolution, that they were both Southerners, so they had this great Southern accent when they talked about it. But he wanted to make a revolution with human performance technology. But in the process, one of the things that Joe did is he built a rather successful business based on teaching other people how to do stuff instead of doing projects. So that's really what I started in the early 2000s. I started to focus much more on delivering training to people and then coaching them through it, as a lot of our colleagues have done way bigger and more interesting versions of that than we've done. But the idea was you teach people some new stuff and then you go help them apply it. And that was great. That was a big deal. But one of the things that was interesting about Joe's work, and he's right, we had a lot of conversations about this. He was teaching things like front-end performance analysis. And what he was a proponent of job aids. And he was a genius making decision tables and checklists and so forth that was user tested and really helped people perform well. And the thing is, he wanted to be able to teach people to be performance analysts and performance improvement people, and he wanted to have a really replicable result. So in other words, he wanted to be able to take a team of a whole bunch of people or people at different companies, run them through his program, and have them basically approach the analysis process and come out with pretty much the same results. And that's admirable and brilliant, and he did it with very detailed job aids. If you look at Joe's job aids, his program is still around, it's available even though he passed away. But you know, in the analysis process, essentially, there's all these little boxes of checking off about importance and behavior and accomplishments and stuff. And it was brilliant. And there were some people who adopted it, and there were some big companies that adopted it, Boeing, the Coast Guard, and so forth. But there was a problem because even though it was very powerful and replicable, and some big companies adopted it, most people didn't continue to use it. So this was a little frustrating because you say, wow, Joe did it, man. He was able to predict and control the organism, you know. He was able to arrange through job aids and training and support a system so that behavior analysts and performance improvement folks would very reliably do a really good job. But the problem is the more precise and the more detailed it got, the narrower and narrower the audience got. And the more people say, yeah, I've been through Joe's program, it's really great. Are you doing it? Well, not really. I got a couple good concepts from it. So given what we've done with the 6 boxes at this point, I started thinking about, well, maybe we should do another experiment. Maybe we should do another lab. Maybe we should try to go in the opposite direction. And instead of having people's noses buried really deep into the job aids, maybe we should just teach them to think like performance technologists, like behaviorists, like performance thinkers, as one of our clients started calling it, so that they may not come out with exactly the same solution every time, but they will continuously approach their own performance and the performance of people they work with and for and serve in a consistent way that's compatible with what we know from behavior science and performance technology. So again, there's a lot of methodologies out there, and I'm just going to flash this at you, but the thing about it is, most of them are kind of complicated. And this is just from a couple of articles. These are brilliant tools. They're really useful, they're very powerful. I'm sure you'll recognize 1 or 2 of them. This is the one that ISPI happens to use. They're all good. And I don't have any problems with them, but the deal is that what I find is, I don't know if you remember this, but during the 2008 presidential election, there was this thing where Obama would do in his speeches. And he'd be talking, you know, and he'd say, you know, the funny thing is I have a lot of Republicans coming up to me, and they say, you know, And he'd always say, well, that's great, but why are you whispering, you know? And I've been at the ISPI conference and other places where a number of our colleagues who were very sophisticated performance improvement people would come up and say, I've been through Rumler's program, I've been through this, I've been through that, but you know, I can't, it's like we can't do it in our organization. It's too complicated. It takes too much time. The executives push back on it. I really like your 6 boxes thing because it's straightforward and we can communicate with it. So someplace in the early 90s, or 2000s, or whatever, my partner and I started thinking about this and said, wait a minute, maybe we can use what we have and do a little bit more with it to be able to communicate, before we get into the details, a way of thinking about performance that is accessible to everybody. And so that's kind of what we started out to do because I guess I've already made this point, because we wanted to achieve rapid penetration and widespread application based on what we know about behavior science and performance technology. And we wanted to do it what I describe as all levels and functions. In other words, one of the things that gets really excited listening to Joe's talk this morning is how effective Aubrey Daniels' group of people have been at taking what we know about performance management to frontline folks and really embedding it in organizations. Now, I started more with people I call performance professionals than with managers. In other words, my original home territory was instructional designers, process improvement folks, people on the staff side of organizations who are doing big projects. And many of those people have the patience and the bandwidth to use the more geeky models, or at least claim they do. But an awful lot of them don't. And as things move rapidly, first of all, there aren't enough of them. They need, buy-in, but actually collaboration with, they need to partner with their stakeholders. They need to have conversations. They don't need to go away in their room and do some secret program and then launch it. They need to actually collaborate and communicate with people. And so what we wanted to build was a language and a framework that could be used technically for sure, but with a focus on communication and collaboration with anybody in the organization. That was our goal, not just for specialists and experts. So I just like to stick Steve anytime I can, but you know, the think different part was we were just saying, wait a minute, what can we do that's different? So that's our little piece of the world. And so what we did is we said, what are the obstacles? What gets in the way of this? In other words, if you have a great system or approach to manage performance in a big organization, how do we think about the problems that make this hard? Now, there's lots of ways to think about it, but I started thinking about it in terms of 3 metaphors, and I just want to tell you a little bit about how these got us thinking. The first one is bridges to nowhere. This is another actually old political campaign thing. You may recall the stories about bridges like in Alaska that got funded and then they literally didn't go anyplace. This happens to be the Golden Gate. And I don't know if I'm not sure if we're on the Marin County side or the San Francisco side, but you know, you can't see the other side in the fog in any case. And what this metaphor is an attempt to capture is kind of 2 levels of disconnect in an organization. If you speak with individuals in most companies, depending on how deep they are in the company, they don't really get how what they're doing, sometimes repetitive stuff, sometimes sort of mundane stuff, actually connects to the business results. Now again, one of the things I loved this morning, and I wrote something about this down from Joe's talk, is by having them talk about it, how did this make a difference and what did you do to make it and stuff, you begin to get that connection going. But what we recognized was, the deeper you are in an organization, the harder it is to figure out how filling out this damn form on this system actually is going to help our bottom line or anything. Now, if you have a conversation about it, it turns out you can say, well, you know what? If that form's not complete, we may get into regulatory problems with the feds, or we may have customer service problems, or we may screw up in some other way. So it really does make a difference. But what we recognize, and there's another level of this too, by the way, which is at the programmatic level. It's not just for the individual employee, but so many times in big companies, in some small companies, there's an investment in something. Like we're going to adopt the Six Sigma religion, or maybe the behavior analysis religion, but I like to pick on Six Sigma. And because some companies just say, okay, man, everybody's going to get a green belt and then a black belt. And I work in Korea a bit, and there's some companies that really do it there, big time. Now, you say, what is this going to do for you? And sometimes they have generalities about it's going to reduce waste and improve efficiency and productivity, and that's all good. But an awful lot of it winds up being about getting certifications in some of those organizations. Like, what's it going to do for you? Well, if I get my black belt, then I can be a level 7 manager or whatever. Oops, that's not what we were looking for exactly. So one of the challenges is, how do we connect both individuals and various kinds of interventions we might do to the actual results? And we have a thing we call the performance chain. And this really just takes what, I mean, you guys have, there's different models like this. This is a real simple version of it. This just takes what we learned from Gilbert and Harless, et cetera, and puts it in a picture. Because what we say is there's business results. Those are the things the company cares about. Those are things like profitability and customer satisfaction and risk management. And the stuff that if you're looking at a company as an executive or an owner or maybe an investor, you're going to judge how you're doing as a company or an organization. And then there's what Gilbert called accomplishments, and we changed it to work outputs. That may be an arbitrary change, but in my user testing efforts, I found that a lot of times if you use the word accomplishments, people still seem to think you're talking about verbs and activity. So we use the word work outputs because it's pretty hard to argue with that. It's a thing, and it's the output or product of work, and that's what we're looking for. So these are things. These are nouns. And we'll come back to that in a minute. These are the things that are produced by behavior. And then we do all this stuff to try to make the behavior happen. And this is, we happen to call them behavior influences, not influencers, but influences. Now, if you blow this out and give some examples, business results are things like product sales and revenues and profits and employee engagement and time to market and all those things, again, that we're looking at the highest level in the business. We want to be able to have a line of sight to understand how what we're doing connects up with the organization. And then work outputs are all nouns. Now, if you go to our website, you'll see this list too, but this is a list of, this is not meant to be comprehensive. But what we found was when we used to start out talking about work outputs or accomplishments, people kind of glommed onto just a subset of those. They think of deliverables, like reports and stuff. That's fine. But there's other kinds that are a little bit different. For example, a decision is a work output. You have to go through lots of behavior to produce it, but at the end, you got a decision. You got a hiring decision or a funding decision or a whatever it is decision. That's a thing. And it may be embodied in a document or an email or conversation, but it's a noun. It's not a verb. Relationships are one of my favorite ones. Because if you think about it, in your personal or professional life, there's a bunch of relationships you have. And for example, in order to have a productive collaborative relationship, you have to be sure that that thing, we're going to call it a thing, even though that sounds rather impersonal, has certain characteristics. Like, for example, for mid-level managers at Microsoft, they respond to my emails and telephone calls in a timely fashion. They'll work toward me with, we'll work together toward common goals, and we mutually respect one another professionally. For a group of people we worked with there, those are the 3 criteria for a good, productive working relationship. So, and you do a bunch of stuff to establish and maintain those relationships. So those are things. You can actually look at those as things. Sales relationship, obviously. You know, like at Genentech, which was one of our clients years ago, I talked to the reps, these senior reps, and they were working with docs, and they said, well, you know I've got a good relationship with the doc, it's when he gives me his cell phone number and when he calls me to know about the research. Those were like the criteria for a relationship. One of my favorite ones, there's a bunch of other ones here, but people who do or produce, that's actually a work output too. Now, where did we get that? We got that from 2 things. One is a customer service environment. Customer service environment, I used to say, what are the outputs of a customer service representative? And people would say, customer satisfaction. I say, no, that's a business result. That's an aggregate measure of some checklisty thing or some rating scale that people got at the end from a whole bunch of people. At the end of a day or a conversation, what is the output? Oh, it's a person who says they liked what I did for them, or it's a person who rates me as 5 out of 5, or it's a person who would refer me to their friends. The other place this came from was training. This is a tough one. When you work with trainers or HR people and you ask them what their work outputs are, they'll always start telling you about their programs. I say, well, that's fine. The training program is good. That's an important output. But who, pardon me, but who gives a damn about the program, really? If at the end we don't have a person who can do do or produce something different or better. So for a trainer, the ultimate product ought to be a trainee who can do or produce something better. And of course, intermediate milestones toward that are training programs and job aids and all that. So anyway, these are nouns, and that shifts people's heads. Man. When they start thinking about that, people think very differently all of a sudden about their work, because instead of it being just about behavior, which is all important, it's what does that behavior produce? So now we can say, when we're examining those best practices, when we're coaching people in the way Joe would suggest and having them have conversations with us about how they accomplished whatever it was, we hope that that accomplishment is defined as a valuable thing, and the behavior is the behavior that was required or was needed or effectively produced that thing. So that's a little bit different way of thinking about stuff, and it's one of the hardest parts of it. And then finally, we got behavior influences. So this is the model we use to teach people what we call the anatomy of human performance. If people can distinguish between those things, whether they're managers or HR people or trainers or executives, they've got a handle on what it is they're trying to deal with. I always say one of the places where that word anatomy came from, it's kind of a silly example, but I always say, look, if I'm going to have a heart surgeon, and he's going to start cutting around in my chest, I want to be sure he knows where the heart is and the lungs and the other vital organs and stuff before I let him mess around with this. Well, same thing is, I frankly believe that unless in the domain we're working with, we can't distinguish between these things. We can't sort of sort stuff into these categories. I'm not so sure I'm confident that we're going to be able to have people do an effective job in improving performance. Now, it's not like I'm going to be a nasty Nazi on teaching this, but I want to do the best job I can, first by using language here, then by giving people hints like, is this a noun or not? If it's a verb, you're probably confusing outputs with behavior, stuff like that, and people start to get clear on this. Now, to answer the bridges to nowhere problem, what is cool about work outputs or accomplishments is we finally have a crisp, clear link from behavior to business results. Because it's the outputs that are valuable, and they're only valuable if we can trace a credible link to business results, whether it's through a process or some other thing, and it's the behavior that produces them, so now we've got a very clear line of sight, and we can teach people that. Parts of the elephant is the second metaphor. And here the point is very simple. In most organizations, there's all these things that people do to try to improve performance. And it's like the blind men with the elephant. Okay, the one that feels the trunk thinks it's a rope. The one that feels the leg thinks it's a tree, and like that. The problem is in most organizations, these things are not aligned and coordinated. They're done all over the place. So of course the 6 boxes model gives us a solution to that. Because if we can teach everybody not just to pick their favorite intervention, but actually to look at the whole set, we've all of a sudden got a way to help people see the whole elephant. And we also, and I don't have time for this now, but these are all linked to one another, and we can start teaching people. Like, for example, Joe was talking about the iPhone this morning and some other stuff. Really, he was talking about tools and resources that make it easier to get to the reinforcers. So you start to understand, or for example, we can do skills and knowledge through training, but if we give people real good tools and job aids, and if we set really clear expectations and provide lots of feedback, we can probably minimize the cost for developing. So there's a lot of relationships we can teach. And then finally, the Tower of Babel, or Babel, which is about multiple languages. We all have these different languages where we talk about performance. And so this is the 21 words in our 2 models. There are not many unplain English words in there. So we've tried really hard to give people a single language that anybody can use. So I've only got a couple minutes here, so let me go real quickly. We then use these models to teach people how to think about performance and improvement. So what are the outputs? How do they link to business results, or do they? What behavior is required? Now let's decide what we're going to measure. Do we measure behavior, work outputs, or business results, some combination of the above? Then let's take a look at the behavior influences. Let's analyze what we got, brainstorm possible improvements, and choose the combination of things we might want to put in place, whether we're a coach or a program designer. Then let's implement and adjust based on measures, and then let's share this language with other people. So that's part of the process we go through. So we have this idea of performance thinking, which I think you can see what it is now. It's a plain English way of sharing understanding of performance with everybody at any level. And we have programs, and this is how we're trying to execute on it. performance professionals, by which I mean training and OD and HR people and like that. You know, we've got a basic introductory class, which is what we're actually going to do here on Saturday. It's a kind of I call it performance literacy program. And then we've got programs for practitioners and champions who really drive it in the organization. And then we enable people to become coaches and facilitators. And then executives and managers we can do a parallel thing with, but it's a different set of programs. And ideally, those things come together in the middle. So the idea is to embed this way of thinking into organizations. And here's an example. I love this example. This is Senior VP of Sales. He's retired now, but from Dun & Bradstreet. Called him one time a few years after we'd worked with him, and I said, remember the 6 boxes thing, John? And he said, yeah. He says, if I can't fit what I'm about to do as an executive or manager into the 6 boxes model, then I don't do it, etc. You can read it. But this is a guy who's a day-to-day senior executive, and he thinks this way. Now, here's a simple example I want to just tell you about a current thing we're doing. In fact, Bill Blunt, who, I can't say the company name up here. Oops, this is on tape, so I can't say it on tape either. Anyway, it's a very large biotechnology firm that happens to be in this region. This is what we've done there. We started out by delivering introduction to performance thinking to a set of training and development people, basically in the operations organization. They got kind of excited. So we then put them through the practitioner program, which is a program where we give people a set of tools, we run them through a workshop, and then we coach them through projects over time. And these are not managers, these are people trying to do projects. And then one person got certified to deliver that program internally. So he can now go out and spawn his own group of practitioners who use this approach. And he, over the last year and a half or so, has produced about 50 practitioners in the operations organization. More recently, because I'm sort of Dr. 6 Boxes or whatever, Senior VP called me into the organization to work on a big, high visibility process improvement project where they wanted to incorporate 6 Boxes performance thinking because they think it's a pretty big part of their performance strategy. So we're getting attention at the high level. We're in the process of introducing 6 Boxes performance coaching, which is a way to just do one-to-one coaching using these models. First for the practitioners, so they can work with their clients, and then with the practitioners' clients, so they can manage their peers, or coach their peers, their subordinates, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, we're getting to sales management. So it's not so much the details of this, but the fact that we've got this language which just works for everybody. And I think, frankly, what I heard this morning probably works for everybody too, what ADI is doing. But this has been our effort to try to get a broad sweep of a shared understanding of performance that can produce results. And here's some simple examples for some of those, from some of those practitioners. And this is in operations in their factory environment, but error reduction, reductions in cycle time, dramatic reductions in setup time from 5 days to, or 8 hours to 48 minutes. But these are the kinds of results that people start to see, and then they get very excited about it. So we help our clients apply this in lots of ways. The intention is, as I said, that it's not just experts, but it was really Skinner, Lindsley, the other folks I mentioned, Tom Gilbert and Joe Harless, and Steve Jobs, who helped us get there. So anyway, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it, and hope this was helpful to you.